Welcome to Whisky Cast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 758 for March 10th, 2019. Coming up in a few minutes.
There is a certain type of man that just looks right through you, and if you say anything about whiskey, it's kind of in one ear and out the other. He'll trample over what you're saying. But when other women said, yep, this is exactly right, I was like, oh my goodness, thank God that it's not just me, you know. I'm sure Rachel Berry gets it from time to time.
Can we all acknowledge once and for all that whiskey's old boys club era is over, and maybe start behaving like it? Apparently, a lot of men have yet to get the message. This week, Los Angeles-based freelance brand ambassador Kat Augustin wrote a column for The Whiskey Wash, calling guys out for their bad behavior at whiskey festivals, and her comments generated a lot of Me Too's from women all over the whiskey business. Kat Augustin will join us in a few minutes on Whiskey Cast in Depth. We'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, the calendar of events, your voice, and much more, all on this edition of Whiskey Cast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Whiskey Cast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. For the second time in less than a year, we have to report on an accident at Sazerac's Barton 1792 distillery in Bardstown, Kentucky. Investigators are still trying to figure out why one of the legs that supported a massive storage tank collapsed on Tuesday. That failure led to the failure of the entire tank, along with punctures in two other storage tanks, and the spillage of an estimated 120,000 gallons of distiller's beer. The tanks were so-called beer wells that hold wash between fermentation and distilling. The beer overflowed the containment berms surrounding the tanks, but according to State Environmental Department officials, Barton workers were able to keep it from flowing into the creek that runs through the distillery campus. That's the same creek that suffered a massive fish kill last June when half of a Barton warehouse collapsed with around 9,000 barrels of whiskey inside and sent raw whiskey flooding into the creek. The rest of that warehouse came down on July 4th with no additional environmental impacts. By the way, no cause has ever been announced for the warehouse collapse. Unlike that accident, this one did leave two people with minor injuries. Both were treated and released from Flaggett Memorial Hospital in Bardstown. We're less than 3 weeks away from the scheduled March 29th exit of Great Britain from the European Union, and there is still no divorce agreement in place. While some industries have the option to move their production out of the UK to Europe, that is an option Scotch whiskey makers do not have, and they're getting more and more nervous as the deadline gets closer. Leonard Russell is the managing director of Ian MacLeod Distillers.
I am worried about Brexit, but I think it's because we don't know exactly what's going to happen. And really, if we had more clarity about how it is going to affect trade between the UK and the EU, if we knew what was happening, I would feel much more relaxed. But I find it quite frustrating at the moment that the politicians are fighting amongst themselves rather than working together to get a proper deal agreed. So no deal or extending is just adding to the frustration, really.
Here's one example. Right now, Ian MacLeod's standard Glengoyne and Tamdhu labels used for its UK whiskies work all over the European Union. But unless there's an agreement on how to handle trade between the two post-Brexit, Russell says they might have to create special labels for each EU country they export to. It's not something they can't handle, but they'd like to know what the ground rules are going to be ahead of time. Meanwhile, Brown-Forman released its third-quarter earnings report this week, and the impact of import tariffs on bourbon and other American whiskeys in Europe, Canada, China, Mexico, and other countries is becoming more clear. The company's net sales for the quarter were up by 3% over a year ago, but the need to lower wholesale prices to its overseas distributors to make up for the tariffs knocked an entire percentage point off those results. Chief Financial Officer Jane Moreau told analysts the company is looking at a potential hit from the tariffs of up to $125 million for the entire fiscal year. Brown-Forman shares took a hit in New York trading after the announcement, but rebounded to end the week up 10 cents a share from a week ago. Last time around, we reported on the shortage of Japanese whiskeys, and it looks as though that shortage will continue for a while. I spoke with Suntory Holdings CEO Takeshi Ninami Thursday night in New York City.
We are sticking to quality. So we don't want to go for kind of mediocre products, which means my apologies to global consumers that we can't supply enough. But we want to stick to quality. So which means we are not in a position to be able to supply enough to the world demands. But we will be back, maybe 5, 6, 7 years from now.
Ninami and a number of his colleagues flew over from Tokyo for the launch of Legent Bourbon, a collaboration between Suntory Chief Blender Shinji Fukuyo and Jim Beam Master Distiller Fred No. Ninami calls Legent a key milestone in the 5-year-long integration between Suntory and Beam.
This is the masterpiece of Suntory and Beam Suntory to demonstrate East can meet West. That means our skill is blended with the Kentucky skill. And the Kentucky bourbon is fantastic. And plus our expertise skill set, which has been accumulated in Yamazaki Distillery.
You also released Suntory AO, in Japan, which combines all 5 of the whiskey-making regions where Suntory has distilleries. That was equally a coup. Might we see that outside of Japan at some point?
Well, at some point, we'll think about that. But we want to demonstrate that we are very innovative. That's called the Yatte Minahare, which is a founding spirit that is always unique. And we have to be different from others. That's our motto.
It has been a little over 5 years now since the acquisition and the merger. Are you happy with the way things have worked out?
Definitely. Because of the leadership of Matt Shattuck, we did a great job. And we became one team and one family. So I'm so pleased and proud of it.
Thursday night's event was the swan song for Matt Shattuck, who is stepping down as Beam Suntory's CEO in the next several weeks. He'll be succeeded by longtime Beam Suntory executive Albert Bellotti. As for Legent, there is no Japanese whiskey in it, but there is definitely a Japanese influence. I spoke with both Shinji Fukuyo and Fred No in separate interviews.
To blend, we need a different type of whiskey, right? That's why I propose that a wine and sherry cask finish to create a Legent.
What we did was we took bourbon that I made in Kentucky, put some in sherry casks and red wine barrels, finished them, and then after we decided that it had been in those barrels long enough, we brought them out and then mixed it with bourbon and then those two. So it was a 3 fluid stream going into the final blend.
So what did you learn from this that you didn't know before?
Oh, well, we don't do a lot of blending in Kentucky, but what we did, the secondary finishing, we've done before. But, bringing those fluids together after the finishing was something new for us.
Do you think you'll be doing more bourbons?
Oh, yes. Through the Regent development, I had a lot of experience, but still not enough yet. So probably there are much more room to be improved from my point of view.
Legent is being rolled out into select U.S. markets right now with a recommended retail price of $34.99 a bottle. I'll have my tasting notes for it later on. We should note that while Suntory is experiencing shortages of its whiskeys in Japan, the 2019 edition of the Essence of Suntory Whiskey series has been unveiled. There are 3 Yamazaki single malts in the series, a 10-year-old matured in refill sherry casks, and 2 9-year-olds, one aged in Spanish ex-Montilla wine casks, and one matured in virgin Spanish oak casks. They're only being sold in Japan, though, and in limited amounts. One other note out of the Beam Suntory family, where their Irish team will be releasing a new 16-year-old Tyrconnell single malt next month. You've likely tried whiskeys matured in Oloroso sherry casks, and maybe you've tried some finished in Muscatel wine casks. But Tyrconnell's John Cashman told me this one combines both.
The next one to hit the market is going to be a Tyrconnell 16-year-old, which has matured or finished, actually not matured, it's matured in bourbon, and then finished in a barrel that held Oloroso and Muscatel. So it's got a beautiful sort of summer fruit, all that element, really rich, red, ripe fruit element coming through on it. Delicious whiskey.
I've never seen a barrel before that was used for both Oloroso and Muscatel.
Yes, I haven't heard of anyone doing that either. So we got it from a broker. We got some, it formerly held Oloroso. And then after, I think, about 18 months, the Oloroso was dumped and Muscatel was put in for 6 months. So it just gives this added complexity to the whiskey that we haven't had with any of our releases so far.
It'll have a recommended retail price of around $100 a bottle, and I'll have tasting notes for it in a few minutes. Elsewhere in Irish whiskey, and with St. Patrick's Day this coming weekend, we are seeing a lot of Irish whiskey news. While it hasn't received a lot of attention, we should note that Sazerac has completed its rebranding of the Paddy Irish whiskey brand that it acquired from Irish distillers 3 years ago. While the whiskey inside the bottle is still supplied by Middleton Distillery, it's been rebranded as Paddy's with an S, and still gets its name from the late Paddy Flaherty, who sold whiskey all over Ireland for the Murphy family for decades, and eventually lent his name to the whiskey. Now, Conor McGregor's proper No. 12 whiskey from his Ireborn Spirits Company had some supply hiccups after its debut in the U.S. and Ireland last fall. Those issues have been resolved, though. Proper No. 12 made its debut in the UK this past week, and it'll debut in Australia this week. I asked Ireborn's Brian Axelrod whether the launch of Proper No. 12 lived up to expectations.
No, it's been better. Our launch has been unbelievable, whether you're talking about just sales throughout Ireland, the U.S., it's blown all of our expectations away. And then if you look at our social media following, which nowadays is very important. It's been the following and the engagement has been just remarkable. It's been unbelievable.
You just hit the UK this week. What's coming?
So we got Australia coming the following Monday, and then who knows? We have other sizes coming. We have a lot of stuff coming up down the line.
You had trouble though meeting demand during the second half of 2018. It took some time to get that resolved. Have you been able to get it to the point where you can stock all these countries?
Now we can. So it's been out there known that we did have a little glass issue, and we sold a little bit more product than we expected to in our launch. What some people thought we'd sell in a year, we sold in 3 weeks. So right now we've got that steadied. We have our own bottle mold, and we're set to go. So we wouldn't launch a market if we didn't think we can meet demands.
While McGregor started out hyping Proper No. 12 as a high-end Irish whiskey at its launch, Axelrod said the pricing was intended to make it accessible to new whiskey drinkers as an entry-level whiskey. At the other end of that scale, the Dublin Liberties Distillery is releasing 3 limited edition Irish single malts. Murder Lane is 13 years old and finished in Hungarian Tokaj wine casks. Keeper's Coin is a 16-year-old finished in Pedro Jimenez sherry casks, while King of Hell is 27 years old and finished in Bordeaux wine casks. Only 50 bottles of that one will be available at 2,700 euros each. That's around $3,033 at current exchange rates. Keeper's Coin will sell for around 340 euros. Murder Lane will carry a 160 euros price tag. That's around $180. Turning now to Scotch whiskey, Tamdhu is releasing a new 15-year-old single malt. It's matured in a combination of American and European oak Oloroso sherry-seasoned casks. It'll carry a recommended retail price of £85, around $110 a bottle. And Ben Romick is releasing a new peated sherry cask Speyside single malt. 6,500 bottles of the 8-year-old whiskey will be available for around £75, around $98 each. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney single malt with Viking soul. If you're in the northern hemisphere, the days are getting longer as spring gets closer, and it's time to welcome the light, Highland Park's 17-year-old limited edition single malt. You can find out more about the light at highlandparkwhiskey.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. Middleton Master Distiller Brian Nation will be at Julio's Liquors in Westboro, Massachusetts, this coming Wednesday night, March 13th. Finn McCool's in Guelph, Ontario will have a Sip Me, I'm Irish tasting that same night. Catoctin Creek Distillery in Purcellville, Virginia hosts yoga at the distillery on the 14th. Keeling Whiskey Company in Dublin, Ireland has its annual Spirit of Dublin St. Patrick's Day Craft Fair on Saturday the 16th. The New Orleans Bourbon Festival is March 20th through the 23rd. I'll be in Cornwall, Ontario for the Wonderful World of Whiskey show that weekend, and the Midlands Whiskey Festival is that same weekend in Stourbridge, England. The Taipei Whiskey Club in Taiwan is holding a meetup on the 27th at the Hammer in New Taipei City. Binny's in Chicago hosts Bourbon Women Night that same night, the 27th, and its annual World of Whiskeys Festival on the 28th, just one day ahead of Whiskey Fest Chicago on the 29th. And Whiskey Live London is on March 29th and 30th. Right now, we have 220 different events on the searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. If you have a festival, tasting, or any other whiskey-related event coming up, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to let us know all about it. We'll be glad to add it to the list.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
WhiskyCast In Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. This past Friday, March 8th, was International Women's Day. Over the years, we have tried to feature many of the women working in the whiskey industry. Most of the time, we have tried to not make a big deal out of the fact that they're women. Because when you're drinking a whiskey, you're not going to be able to tell by what's in your glass whether it was made by a man or a woman. Whiskey knows no gender. Sadly, though, society at times appears to pay attention to little else but gender. And even more sadly, we still cannot seem to get some men to wake up to the fact that whiskey knows no gender. This week, freelance brand ambassador and single malt specialist Kat Augustin wrote a story for The Whiskey Wash, highlighting some of the stuff that she's had to take from men who just can't bring themselves to admit that a woman might know more about whiskey than they do. And the social media response to that column from other women in the whiskey industry showed just how widespread the problem is. So Kat Augustin joined me on the phone from her home in the Los Angeles area. What's the reaction been since this came out the other day? Because I've seen a lot of comments about it on Twitter. What have you heard?
Well, my Facebook and LinkedIn and my Twitter and Instagram just all blew up. So, 50 new friend requests and followers and, people commenting and sharing. And then a lot of contacts that I haven't heard from in a while reaching out, which is good. It's definitely good to be on somebody's radar when you're looking for a job, a whiskey home. And actually I've gotten some feedback from friends that, want to say, well, guys, it's kind of the same gripe, I guess. Like, guys do that to other guys too. It's called one-upmanship. Like, it's not just women that get this treatment. It's other men too. And I suppose I should have included the point that it's like, right, from other men, never from women. Like, a woman would not approach me at a whiskey show and start one-upping me. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense to me. I mean,
yeah.
I think I responded to one of those tweets that, guys one-up each other, but they assume that there's a certain amount of basic knowledge there, and they're just sort of trying to prove their superiority. But with women, that sort of lack of a second X chromosome sort of generally leads one to assume that the person is automatically not as intelligent or not as experienced. And I know we need to behave better. Tell me what your experience has been, because I can't speak to any of this because I don't see it from your perspective. So tell me what it's like.
Well, if you are interested in whiskey and you want to discuss whiskey, and because the only thing I like more than learning and listening about whiskey is talking about it and sharing the interesting trivia and history and facts with other people. But if you're interested and you are talking with me, just give me 10 minutes and you'll know that I have a very firm grasp on its history and the timeline and the evolution and even, kind of the future, like foreseeing what's going to happen to the industry in the coming years. And I have a good nose and I have a keen palate. But if you're not interested in that 10 minutes of actually getting to know someone and hearing them out, and, just like when you get to know anyone, you ask them questions and relate with personal experiences. And if you're not going to do that, then you're probably just going to think that I am an idiot. And I feel for you, you know what I mean? Because I have a lisp and I kind of talk like a valley girl, and, I use my hands a lot when I talk, and I'm full of like likes and knows and ofs. So I get that I can be easily dismissed. And so I think part of my journey is just, saying, hey, I'm here too, tag, I'm in, tag me in,
What happens behind that stand at a whiskey show when you're working on behalf of a brand and guys start coming up and start talking to you? And I use the talking to you more like a talking at you.
Right.
Way.
Right. Well, they they usually think that I'm a promotional person, which is fine. They have a important job to do, and they're usually dressed a certain alluring way, so they usually think that I'm promotional, and so I actually don't engage them unless I have kind of sussed them out as somebody that is receptive. So usually I'm just kind of pouring what they ask me to pour, and based on what they're saying, I will chime in, and I'll say, oh yes, that's great. Like, I prefer this to the 18-2, or, this, we call this our Sean Connery of scotches, and, just the little jokes and asides that every brand ambassador kind of has a canned response when, you're just going to meet someone for 30 seconds and then they're going to be on their way to another booth. And then sometimes I will hear guys talk about what I'm pouring, and it's just so wrong. You know what I mean? It's just, it's so, it's not even close to what it actually is. And like I mentioned in the article, I don't want to correct because I think it's impolite, but I will usually try to steer their conversation into discovery just by asking questions like, oh, you think it tastes like this? That's interesting. Well, what else do you like to drink? Like, well, what do you like about that? What was your first whiskey? How did you get interested in whiskey? I want to, recommend this to you because if you like this and this, then you'll love this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I guess what usually happens is that I'm just not engaged with, not when there's somebody like Rick Edwards standing next to me, the guys with the full beards and, oftentimes in kilts, and they're so gregarious and they're just such strong, lovable personalities. I have absolutely seen guys fan out on these brand ambassadors like Rick Edwards and Martin DeRoz and, Travis Tidwell. It's so funny. Like, it's like they're celebrities being bombarded, and they want to find a back exit to sneak out of. They don't want to go out the front because they're just going to get mobbed. And, these guys, after a few whiskeys, just look at them with such admiration and like, oh, wow, your job is so cool, and you know so much about Scotch, and that's so wonderful. And yeah, it's an interesting thing to see. And I kind of feel like a Vanna White at that point. You know what I mean? Like, I'm happy to help. But when you meet someone that really has an affinity for whiskey, and right away by how they're tasting and what they're saying, and that's where the money is right there, is getting to hear about what other people think of certain expressions. And then they ask me, and then, we get to share, like, because, there are so many interesting kind of just hidden trivia gems within whiskey. So it's so funny the things you find out, and, you go home and research, or, you think that maybe that fact is incorrect, or it's something that you heard someone else say and you've just been repeating it and you're not sure. And that ranges from pronunciation to dates to, there are, certain scholars that have different opinions as far as what originated where. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm rambling on your podcast, which is usually so concise and sharp.
We'll edit all this out, of course.
Thank you.
I know both Rick Edwards and Marty DeRoz, and I have to admit, I'm not sure if I've met Travis or not, but these are all guys that have built up respect not only among the whiskey drinkers, but also within the community. And I know these guys as gentlemen who would not treat you the way that you get treated at some of these shows, because they know you and they know you know your stuff.
Oh yeah, like if you're behind the booth, it's because you've worked really hard and you have a passionate interest and you're a go-getter. And a lot of the people that come to tastings and conventions and shows and so forth, it's a company thing where they've been brought by a friend, and sometimes they don't have any interest in whiskey, but it's a fun, glamorous event for their law firm or whatever. But no, the guys that know their stuff, that's really what I mean. I have met the best people in the world because of whiskey. You've been like so tremendously supportive, clapping back to guys on Twitter, which I just think is awesome, silencing the naysayers. And, Frank Jakubka with Bacardi, do you know Frank, former Brewery Lottie ambassador? He was tremendously supportive, and I know that something will blossom, and I'll land at a home that's just like a perfect fit. But I feel tremendous support from a lot of men in the industry, the brand ambassadors, just because they have seen my passion, and they've seen just how dedicated I am to wanting to get the gospel out there. And I feel like philosophically we all agree, like we're not going to be naysayers, because there are some aspects of the industry where you just kind of have to roll your eyes because you're like, all right, this is getting ridiculous. Like the marketing here has really jumped the shark, But I'm never going to write a post hating on another expression, because it's only good for the industry if these prices are crazy and people are clamoring for them. So one whiskey's win is everybody's whiskey win. So the gentlemen within the industry have just been, they've gone to bat for me, and they've sent my resume along and given me tips. And, Martin Duras is just a real mentor. And then within the whiskey fabric, do you know that hashtag whiskey fabric?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's real. It is tremendous how many friends and contacts I've made from Instagram and Twitter. And, and then you can, even though you don't know these people personally, you can get a sense of what they're interested in. And then when you do meet them in real life, it's like, oh, it's you. Okay, I know you. It's really tremendous. And even though it is mostly boys, it doesn't feel like a boys' club. I can talk all day long about the contributions women have made in whiskey, but at the shows and at the events and so forth, I definitely feel like I'm one of 1 to 3 women that are around.
The thing that I was really impressed with after your column came out was the number of women who work in ambassador roles and work around the industry who all echoed and said, yeah, we get the same thing. It's not just you. We're getting this also, and it's commonplace.
Oh, that made me so happy to see, because I'm like, oh gosh, maybe I'm going to be perceived as a bit of a grouch. And I'm certainly not someone that's misandrist or doesn't like men, and that's not what I meant to convey at all. Just that there is a certain type of men that just looks right through you. And if you say anything about whiskey, it's kind of in one ear and out the other. He'll trample over what you're saying. But when other women said, yep, this is exactly right, I'm just like, oh my goodness, thank God that it's not just me. I'm sure Rachel Berry gets it from time to time. But I got a message from a woman that was just like, this is the script. What they said, it's like they're all reading from the script. Golf trip to Scotland, check. Macallan, check. Johnny Walker Blue, check. Calling something peaty that's not peaty, check.
I would love sometime, and I know this will never happen, but I think it would be funny to go to a whiskey show and give every woman working at a stand a whistle And every time a guy says something like those things that you mentioned on the list, or does something stupid or mansplains or interrupts, the woman behind the stand gets to blow the whistle. I have a feeling it would sound like a New York City intersection at rush hour with the whistles going off.
Oh my gosh, it's so fun. That's such a funny idea. It's so creative. And the fun thing is that it gets louder and it gets more ridiculous as the night goes on, because people have traveled around and it just kind of loosened up and they're more boisterous and conversational. So by the very end of the night, it would be just like a long sustained whistle blow, just.
You're being charitable there because they're pretty much hammered by the end of the night after tasting 10 or 15 whiskeys.
Oh my gosh, totally. Totally. It's so funny. And it's funny to see people start at your booth at the beginning of the night and then end at it, because it's like this transformation from like upright, respectful, person to just talking out of school.
Frat boy behavior.
And right. It's funny. It's nice to see the change actually from a mostly sober perspective, because you have to be so fast thinking and on your feet. I have done shows where I have not paused to eat, or I just like have like a water bottle under the table and I'm on my feet talking for like 4 hours, and I don't even break to go to the ladies' room, and the time just flies right by. I enjoy it so much. So you can understand how if you're excited to go talk about whiskey and people don't want to hear it from you, it's very deflating. And then you kind of, I feel like I kind of have to elbow my way in and, take my airspace and just kind of announce loudly, like, I know this, and this is what you mean by this, and let me introduce you to this. It's, sometimes I kind of feel like an annoying little sister, because that's how I'm treated. I think the most interesting experience to date that exemplifies this is I was at a Lefroy tasting at 7 Grand downtown, and John Campbell was the guest. So, of course, there was a line out the door, and I had arrived early, and, I had my notebook and pen, and I was so excited, and there was a man that came up to a man in front of me in line, and he said, "What are you guys in line for?" And this guy sat in front of me said, "A whiskey tasting." And then he said, "Oh, well, where's the whiskey from?" And the guy in front of me said, "Ireland." And because I just can't let that go. You know what I mean? That's too glaringly wrong. I had to pipe up. I'm like, "It's from Scotland." And the guy in front of me turned and looked at me and he was like, "Oh, right, Scotland. Okay." And then the gentleman asked him again, how old is it? No, he said, it's a new brand. And again, I can't handle this. So I'm just like, no, it was established in, is it 1821? Can you fact check that for me?
Something like that.
Something, yeah, 1821, 22, maybe 1822. I'm just going to go to my cabinet and look at a bottle. And then so, I give him the exact date, and then the guy just keeps asking the man in front of me, 1815. He keeps asking the man in front of me all of these questions, and the guy keeps turning to me for the answers. So he was just like, well, who is this guy? And he's like, the master distiller. Well, what does the master distiller do? And the guy didn't know. And so I'm like, well, he's the one that decides what the distillery makes through blending and tasting. And then at one point, he kept looking at me and then asking the guy in front of us all of his inquiries. And I just said, why do you keep talking to him? He doesn't know. Every time you ask him a question, he looks at me and I answer it for you, and then you keep asking him. Like, I'm the one that knows. And I was a brat, and I was curt, and he just gave me the dirtiest look and just kind of spun away on his heel, you know.
His loss.
Yeah, but it was really funny because I thought to myself, I'm like, well, you know, I was a little bit of a jerk just then, but this is why. You know, this is why I'm a jerk. I had answered 4 questions, and he just kind of barely looked at me and kept asking this man that did not know, that told him he did not know. And it was a great night, actually. I got to have a wonderful chat with Mr. Campbell, and, you know, just he's such a pro. That was just one of the best tastings I've ever attended. So, yeah, you know what? You're right. It was his loss. He should have chatted with me and waited in line.
And he might have
learned
something.
a thing or two himself. Yeah, oh, you bet. I have myriad examples of this, but that's kind of my favorite one because that is a time where I was not on the clock and I could sass back.
That's where that background in stand-up comedy helps too, right?
Yeah. I suppose so. I'm not thirsty for conversation. Like, it's just not in my wheelhouse to, like, want to embarrass someone. But if you're embarrassing yourself in an impolite way, I do want to correct. I want to correct that behavior. And, you know, sometimes it just comes from bartenders at the bar, you know, like I'll say, hey, you know, in your craft cocktail menu, it says you have an Isla whiskey in this. What Isla whiskey do you have? And this bartender was just like, it's just a scotch. And I said, right, yeah, what scotch? And he was like, no, Isla is just like a region of Scotland. And I'm like, right, yeah, what kind? And he was like, it's just a kind of scotch. It's just like, it's its own separate, like in Scotland, there are all these different regions. And then I finally had to interrupt him. I'm just like, I understand. I am asking you what brand. And then he just kind of sneered at me and he was like, Ardbeg. And I'm like, all right, thank you. Like, how hard was that? You know, but it's so funny how, I don't know why some people think that whiskey is esoteric knowledge that a woman can't know. But yeah, it happens a lot.
Guys, Kat Augustin has been keeping notes on those conversations with bartenders. Don't be surprised if we see more commentary from her in the future. You can also catch Kat's whiskey reviews on Incompatible, her podcast with Mike Frank. By the way, a year ago this week in episode 684, we heard from Georgie Bell and Becky Paskin about the Our Whiskey Project, which they created to highlight diversity in the whiskey industry. It is still going strong, and you can find out more about it on social media. Just search for the hashtag OurWhiskey, and you can listen to that interview in the archives at whiskycast.com. That's WhiskyCast In Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Isla single malt. Look for the new House Lannister Lagavulin 9-year-old. It's part of the Game of Thrones single malt Scotch whiskey collection from Diageo and HBO. You'll find it at a whiskey shop near you, and check out the rest of the Lagavulin single malts at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Let's start off with the Legent bourbon that we heard about during the news. It's bottled at 47% ABV. The nose has notes of caramel candy, dried flowers, mango, a hint of toffee, and subtle spices. The taste is spicy, but not overpowering, with tropical fruits, honey, vanilla, and caramel that add a nice balance. And the finish is long and fruity with lingering spices in the background. It's probably not for every bourbon lover, but I like it, and I'm scoring Legent Bourbon a 93. The other day, I received a sample of the new Octomore 10 years old Dialogos edition from Bruichladdich. It's bottled at 56.8% ABV, And for those who need to know the peating level, it's peated to 167 parts per million of phenols. That gives it a smoky, pungent nose with a slight ashiness and notes of grilled fruits, pipe tobacco, caramel, and vanilla. The taste is smoky, dry, and spicy, with touches of clove, cinnamon, leather, pipe tobacco, sawdust, and just a hint of maltiness. The finish is long and smoky, with hints of toasted coconut and vanilla. I'm scoring Brookladdy's Octomore 10 Years Old Dialogos Edition a 93. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Heaven Hill's rickhouses hold more than 1 million barrels of maturing whiskey. Each and every one of those barrels represents part of Heaven Hill's 85-year tradition of making whiskey, and it's one part of the process that technology can't improve on. Get the whole story at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. The other night, the Irish Whisky Association, the Distilled Spirits Council of the U.S., and the Irish Consulate held a St. Patrick's Day media tasting in New York City. I'll have more from the evening next time around, but it did give me the chance to taste the Bushmills Distillery Exclusive Edition that's normally available only at the Bushmills Distillery in County Antrim. This one was matured for 10 years in a combination of bourbon and sherry casks, then spent a final 6 months in acacia wood casks, before being bottled at 47% ABV. The nose is warming and comfortable, with hints of grilled fruits, old leather, dried flowers, and black tea with honey. The taste is fruity and spicy, with a strong bite of clove and cinnamon that fades gently to reveal honey, citrus fruits, apricots, and just a hint of oak. The finish is very, very long, with hints of spice, sawdust, and honey. I'm scoring the Bushmills Distillery Exclusive Edition a 92. And we heard about Tyrconnell's new 16-year-old Irish single malt, finished in casks used for both Oloroso sherry and Muscatel during the news. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose has notes of plums, apricots, clover, honey, and vanilla. The taste is spicy, tart, and complex, with white pepper, mango, papaya, a hint of coconut, apricots, and honey. I'm scoring the Tyrconnell 16-year-old Oloroso Muscatel finish a 92. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. I'm adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of 2,500 different whiskeys from all over the world. You'll find it at whiskycast.com.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice, presented by Lot 40. The debut of Legion Bourbon the other night led to the usual gnashing of teeth, clutching of pearls, and assorted social media complaints from bourbon purists. Ross Salcow noted on our Facebook page that, quoting now, "I don't like the implication that a bunch of distillate from the same distillery is different from anything out there in the bourbon world." Well, that's the way Beam Suntory described it, and Christopher Hart responded with this: "Well, it's not really bourbon, to be fair, and it's a whiskey specialty, and it's finished." Well, let's make this clear. Whiskey specialty is the category the TTB uses for bourbons and other whiskeys that have been finished in other types of casks, since the official standard for bourbon, along with rye whiskeys, wheat whiskeys, and malt whiskeys, mandates maturation in new charred oak casks. Distillers are allowed to use language along the lines of Kentucky straight bourbon finished in fill in the cask type of your choice here. But let's face it, you are never going to see a whiskey specialties section at your local liquor store. Whiskeys like Legent, Angel's Envy, and the like go right into the bourbon section along with the usual suspects. And then there's what @Jackson Wharf tweeted, Legent is French for fancy pants. Last time around, I talked with Cascade Hollow head distiller and general manager Nicole Austin, and that interview brought this comment from one of her fellow distillers. P.T. Wood of Wood's High Mountain Distillery in Colorado posted this on our Facebook page. Nicole is pretty much the most badass distiller in the world. No arguments there. And after we retweeted a link to Kat Auguson's Whiskey Wash column the other day with this comment, can we please try to get past the mansplaining and how cute crap once and for all? Joel @Odysseus Unbound responded with this. I work with a woman who went to a U.S. college on a full hockey scholarship, and she still gets guys treating her with the how cute BS. It is kind of hilarious to watch her take them down, though. Love it. Thanks, Joel. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always get in touch with us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter @WhiskeyCast, and the email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's close the show out now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other stuff that all make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. Klaus Doppelmann in Austria suggested this week's topic via Twitter the other day. Did you know that Irish whiskey stops maturing the moment a cask is exported from Ireland? Neither did I until I saw the latest William Cadenhead's release with a 27-year-old whiskey carrying an age statement of 11 years. Something for your Behind the Label segment? Better believe it. Let's give our pal Aoife Keane of Irish Distillers credit for answering Klaus's question. Here was her response. Technically, if it leaves the island in a cask, it's no longer Irish whiskey. The regs state maturation has to finish on the island with no further time spent in cask outside of Ireland. Can only be exported in inert container and bottled abroad. And according to Aoife, that's been the rule since at least 1980, when the Irish Whiskey Act was passed. Though technically a whiskey like the one at Cadenhead's could possibly have carried the full 27-year age statement, but then it could not have been called an Irish whiskey. Once again, thanks for that question, Klaus. And if you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, a unique triple-distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskeyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode at whiskycast.com. That's also where you can find our WhiskeyCast HD videos and the WhiskeyCast Tasting Panel podcast, the latest whiskey news, events, cocktail recipes, the whiskey photo of the week, and a whole lot more. Please tell your whiskey-loving friends about WhiskeyCast. Better yet, show them how to use that podcast app on their smartphone or tablet to subscribe to the show and get every episode as soon as it's released. Remember, friends help friends discover podcasts. We'd love to hear from you, even if you have something critical to say. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2019, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.